All right, we're going.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining. I'm going to do it from up here if that's okay.
I don't know, are we muted?
No, I just unmuted us, right? Can you folks on the phone hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Excellent. So why don't all the folks who are participating by the phone or by Skype, if you can mute your lines. If you've called in, you do that by pressing *6. Is that right, David?
Yes.
*6 to mute your line. If you're on Skype, you can go ahead and just press the microphone button so that you get a slash through it so that there's no noise interference. We are recording this. We've successfully worked that out, we believe. So if anyone in your office isn't able to attend today, or there are folks who weren't able to connect via Skype, we will be able to post this as soon as we have the product and we're finished with the presentation. So I think because this call is really just to share information with entities who are seeking site certification and consultants who are doing cultural resources work, we're probably just going to go ahead and get started. I don't think we need to do introductions for the folks that are on the call just to keep this moving forward. So I appreciate you participating, and we will get started.
All right, you ready?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining, both here in person and online. My name is Sarah White. I'm director with Quest Site Solutions. We are a site selection consulting firm based out of Greenville, South Carolina. I'm joined by my colleague, Lindsay Cannon, as well. We have been partnered with IEDA since, I believe, 2012 on this program. So our main focus is site selection for industrial clients, but another part of our business is the site certification, site readiness programs, where we help communities get their properties ready to be more attractive for those industrial users. So just wanted to kind of get into today. Here's our agenda. We're going to talk a little bit the purpose of site certification, why would everybody kind of put themselves through this process there. I'll kick it over to Ann for kind of more of the certification requirements in regards to the SHPO and cultural resources aspects there. The benefits of certification, why everybody would go through this process and really what you get out of it. And then we can wrap up with any questions and answers, concerns at the end. So really the purpose of certification is, as we know, today's environment out there, attracting investment jobs, super competitive. So being prepared creates that advantage. Being prepared is really what all about site certification is all about. So the site certification designation means that you've met some kind of criteria. I want to point out there is no national standard for certification. So one program certification criteria is going to vary compared to the other. So when I'm on the other side of the table with the site selection side, I still have to go through and make sure that project meets my, that site meets my project's parameters, because there is that the national standard. We like to think that at Quest, we're formerly McCallum Sweeney Consultant. We've kind of set that bar as the highest bar on the standard there. But the criteria is really based on our site selection experience. So we really want to look at what are the needs that we see on the project side and to make that more realistic on the site certification side. Site certification is a big trend that's grown over a number of years. We've seen these programs pop up across the country. It's really driven by what we see on the market side. People are trying to get the site selection process decision time frame has shrunk, and then also that time frame to get up and going for companies. So it's really kind of this whole process has really kind of been born out of that we've seen on the private side. Again, it's an initiative we're seeing across the country with states are doing this. We've worked with Iowa, South Carolina, even Wyoming. We had a program. You also see it with electric providers, utilities, rail, different people, and even private landowners are kind of pursuing this as well because they see the advantage of being prepared in order to be competitive. For certification, there are really, I kind of think of three key buckets to a certification there. So one, availability. Is your property really truly available? It's not just somebody saying, oh, my grandma's hairdresser said her son may sell his property. You know, those days of that being kind of available has gone away kind of thing. So we're just putting a sign out saying available and the piece of dirt just doesn't work. So really looking at that availability. Are there any title issues, any things that the property under option, that type of thing. Fully servable. So we're really looking at utilities there. Are the utility lines at the site? And if they are at the site, do they have the capacities to serve an industrial customer? So you'll see kind of our criteria. We have different levels of utility capacities that are required. based on the different site sizes there. So again, looking at electric, natural gas, water, wastewater, and telecom to be able to meet those needs on the utility side. And if those utilities aren't there, is there a cost and schedule associated with getting them there? So again, we don't require everything to be at the site, but it can get there within a timely manner. And then the developability. So, okay, we've talked about control, utilities, but then it has to be developable. Looks like Iowa maybe doesn't have as much on the topo side as some of the other places I look sometimes, but depending on where you are in the state, that might be more of an issue. But really, we're looking at, that's when we're looking at your phase ones, your wetlands. Are we having to look at mitigation, those type things? And really kind of what we're focusing on today with the cultural resources, that kind of falls into the developability of a property. Are there some areas that we need to avoid with that? So we look through all those studies to make sure the property is truly developable for a project. So a well-designed site certification program is realistic. So again, it's really based off of what we see on the project side. We work with utility providers and other partners just to make sure, okay, is what we're requiring, is that realistic, again, for what the needs are on the projects. It's rigorous. So I always say certification is not for the faint of heart. We put you through the ringer for our program, but it's important, again, to kind of have all those answers to any questions that a prospect may have. But again, the site selection process is very exhaustive, so the site certification process kind of mirrors that as well. And educational, it's really helpful to go through this process and go ahead and pull in those different partners that you need at the site visit, at the when you're going through to try to get that information for the questionnaire. Having those partners all in line now is very helpful for when that prospect shows up and you're already on the same page. So it's really an educational process for those economic development allies. So I always feel like whenever I talk about the site selection process, I can't do it without showing a funnel there. So really, this really shows that we really start with a large number of properties that we're looking at. Could be a region, a couple states, those things. And then we're really trying to get down, at the end of the day, we get down to one property that's going to work for that project. So in each of these different stages, there's going to be different cuts that the client is having to make. We're helping them make that informed decision as they go through to get down to that finalist location. The site certification phase really focuses there on that third step, the RFP proposal and screening area. So that's where, if you're getting all these answers now regarding your property in terms of, again, that control, the developability, the servability, you're going to be able to answer very quickly and efficiently for those project requests there for the RFP. So again, site certification doesn't answer all the questions in the funnel there, but it really helps you kind of stay in it longer, being prepared to get you down to kind of that mid phase. And then after that is when all the other attributes of your community, your workforce, those type things can come into play. And then lastly, incentives in that project decision-making process. So now I think we're going to get into more of the nitty-gritty of today, and if you want to kind of cover more on the certification requirements.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. So as you can imagine, with that robust level of rigorous site certification, there are many components that we at IEDA are working with the site applicants on making sure that their sites meet certification. When it comes to cultural resources, the standard, the bar that we've worked on setting is essentially that the site or park's developable acreage is free of areas of archaeological or historical significance or be able to mitigate within 90 days. So for those cultural resources folks in the room or on the call, if you've ever had a project that's worked through mitigation on cultural resources, you know that it typically takes more than 90 days. So I think this is an important threshold to understand from the beginning. It's something that our applicants, the entities seeking site certification, are well aware of, but they might not be as familiar with what it takes to mitigate cultural resources, which is why it's important then for our consultants to also understand that this is the bar that we're trying to reach. So I'm going to go through a couple more slides on how we get there. So essentially what your client, the applicant seeking site certification, has to present to IEDA is the documentation, all of the reports, all of the research, all of that education that Sarah talked about on cultural resources identification. They then consult with the State Historic Preservation Office. So the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, will submit a written response to that consultation. Presumably it is a positive response to go with your packet. And then if there is any avoidance or mitigation areas, clearly having a mitigation plan with costs and timelines is necessary. to prove that you can meet that 90-day requirement. So that's a pretty high bar for getting through site certification, and it's important to know that right from the beginning. So how does IEDA help our recipients, our applicants who are seeking site certification, and our cultural resources investigators get through this? Well, as Sarah said, we've been working on site certification here at IEDA since about 2012. We've incorporated the cultural resources component with some more guidance in 2014. And then we found that we really did need to do a pre-review. So what happens now is that before applicants are requested to come into a step in which they would be required to do cultural resources investigation, we are sitting down with the State Historic Preservation Office and folks here at IEDA, and we're doing a pre-review of your site. So this kind of shows examples of two sites that would come in at that pre-review level. We're getting a chance to see what the area is, what the acreage is, and just get an idea of what level of review might be entailed if it's complicated or different than just a standard review. And then after that pre-review, we do have written comments that are then shared with the entity seeking site certification. So as a cultural resources consultant, it's important to ask your client, hey, did you get any specific guidance for your site from IEDA that could help me with my investigation? And then we follow the memorandum of understanding that's been entered into between our office, the Iowa Economic Development Authority, and the Department of Cultural Affairs here at the state, which houses our State Historic Preservation Office. That document was originally executed in 2014. We've gone through a couple of revisions, I think 2 just in this past year, and we have a revised document executed just last month, September of 2018. It's a 4-page document, as you can see, with really small text, with lots of great information, good definitions, good descriptions, good process information to help the cultural resources investigators know how to address situations. This covers, what do I do if there was a previous survey in my area? What do I do if my area has never been surveyed? What do I do if my area has resources or surveys adjacent to it? So it kind of covers a lot of those things. So be sure to reference this document. But what I want to do today is pull out a few key sentences that I think will help any cultural resources investigator provide a report that is sufficient to successfully consult with the SHPO on site certification. So the very first one is understanding what is a cultural resources identification survey. You'll understand, for those of you who are familiar with cultural resources investigation, that we did not use standard terminology like phase 1 archaeological investigation or intensive level architectural survey, because truly all sites are unique and the level of investigation is going to depend on the type of site we're surveying. So while we will follow those standards, and you'll see that throughout this presentation, the entire product that you're producing for your client, the entity seeking site certification, has to take into consideration all significant archaeological or standing structures resources, both within your area and within a buffer zone that would potentially be impacted by a future development. So we define a cultural resources identification survey as something that will contain background historical research on the certification site, a summary report with recommendations of the likelihood of which the entity requesting site certification would encounter significant cultural resources on the site. In addition to the guidance further on in the MOU, all archaeological investigations shall be conducted in conformance with the Association of Iowa Archaeologists Guidelines 2017. And all standing structures evaluations shall conform with Secretary of the Interior standards for historical documentation and any documentation guidelines established by the Iowa SHPO. I do believe the Iowa SHPO is in the process of generating more comprehensive guidelines for standing structures evaluation. So obviously, as those come out, they would be applicable here. So you can see it's a lengthy kind of description of what it is, but we're trying to set the standard to match that requirement that the consultants have set for site certification. So there's no black and white, this is what you do for every site everywhere. You have to fully evaluate the site and develop your report based on that. So further on in project coordination in the MOU, the entity requesting site certification will hire a qualified cultural resource investigator who meets the Secretary of the Interior standards for archaeology, history, or architectural history as appropriate. So in some cases, in most all cases, archaeology is going to be necessary just based on the type of sites that we're working on. But some may have standing structures within the site area, and you might want an architectural historian. Others may have historic resources nearby, and a historian may be more appropriate. And so really understanding the level of who needs to be working on this report is important from the beginning. So it's minimally equivalent to a phase 1 intensive archaeological survey and an intensive historic architectural survey of the certification site as appropriate, and at least a reconnaissance survey as appropriate within the buffer of the defined area. So all of those words, sort of defined area and certification area, are all defined within the MOU. And you'll notice that I highlighted at least, because as we go through some of the slides on the level of review, you're going to see that there are times when we may need to do more investigation than just a reconnaissance in that buffer area, depending on where resources fall in adjacent to proposed development within site certification. So again, text straight out of the MOU. The purpose of the report is to provide the identification of significant cultural resources on or near the certification site and within the defined area. In some cases, this report may show that it is so unlikely that significant cultural resources are present and that there is no need for additional investigation. If that's the case, the consultant who prepared the report will make that recommendation, provide it to their client, and it will go through consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, and if everyone agrees, we will be done. However, in other cases, the initial CRIS may indicate that additional surveys, perhaps focusing only on particular sub-areas or types of resources, may be recommended. So if that's the case, and the consultant working on this finalizes this report and says, well, I really recommend more research over here, or it's an archaeological report and we identified a site, but we have not yet delineated the site or evaluated the site, that kind of incomplete report, while it may be what you initially signed up for with your client, is not sufficient to conclude consultation. So you have to go back to your client and say, my investigation resulted in inconclusive data. We need to go the next step. We need to do the next thing required by the guidelines or the process. This does not mean submit incomplete consultation documents to the SHPO. This means go the next step, evaluate the site, fully evaluate the standing structure resource. So then once the totality of that CRIS is completed, meaning you've done all of the evaluation, the consultant has made their recommendations as to whether there are sites there or not, there are eligible sites there or not, then you provide that report to the State Historic Preservation Office. The MOU specifies that we need a hard copy report along with an electronic copy and shape files as appropriate. This helps streamline getting this data into the State Historic Preservation Office's inventory. And then the cover letter that generally comes from the entity seeking site certification is going to ask two questions. Is the report in line with the federal guidelines for such a survey, and does it meet the MOU requirements? And two, do you agree with or can you comment on the consultant's recommendations for the probability of significant sites to be located within the site certification area or around it, and if any of those sites are National Register eligible? So I paraphrased those two just for the sake of getting them on the screen, but essentially we're asking two questions. Was the report good enough? And do you concur with the recommendations? And that's how we get through positive consultation for site certification. So I want to talk a little bit about level of effort. These are real sites. I've tried to take away some identifying factors, but they're good conversations to have. So I apologize if these are sites that have given people heartburn in the past, but they're all things that we're working through and getting through. So here, obviously, the site seeking site certification is highlighted in yellow. There are no standing structures within the site. So here, depending on when we do pre-review, we pull up some additional information, but just on initial review, you're obviously going to do a phase 1 archaeological review of the site to make sure that there are no archaeological sites present subsurface on this site. However, we do have a lot of residential properties to the west, and it looks like there's a county fairground to the southwest, and then some industrial buildings. So this site is actually a little bit more complicated than others because it requires a level of evaluation where you have to really try to figure out if you've got National Register resources within that quarter-mile buffer of the site. The MOU specified a 1/4 mile buffer. I think that was something that we struggled with here at IEDA, making sure that we were doing enough, but not too much. For those cultural resources specialists who have worked on, say, cell towers, you know that the area of potential effects of a federal project on a cell tower can be much further than a 1/4 mile buffer. However, if we end up building, in this case, a 1-story light industrial building on the far east side, it's probably going to have no impact on those residential properties to the west. So we tried to balance what that likelihood of impacting cultural resources is based on a variety of potential development styles. Because with site certification, and I'll get to this in a little bit, we don't know what the project's going to be. So we're working very hard to figure out what that level of cultural resources investigation is to not have to have any unknowns at the time that the project comes up. So in this one, we certainly would need some additional reconnaissance work for that perimeter area. Here's another site. Again, we have less standing structures in the buffer area here, and these appear just from aerial to be more recent developments, probably industrial in nature to fit with what may be going in that spot. So here, reconnaissance, a couple of streetscape photographs and analysis of historical photos to show the time of these developments may be sufficient for that report. But you can see now why a Cultural Resources Investigation Survey, CRIS, is unique for every site, because it's not going to fit a single format. There's not a single format that's going to address residential neighborhoods adjacent to it, industrial parks adjacent to it. And then this one I wanted to bring up, particularly because here, again, we have no standing structures, or appears to be no standing structures within the certification area, but we have clearly delineated boundaries that go just around what I can only assume to be farmsteads. I don't know the condition, I don't know the integrity of the farmsteads, but if I were to be looking at this, and if I were the State Historic Preservation Office, I would not be able to take a reconnaissance level or a more research recommended level of evaluation on those properties, because presumably the only access point to this site is going to come very close to those farmsteads, and any development that occurs is likely to be impacted by those. So doing full Iowa site inventory form assessments on whether those are a single structure or a district of structures is important. And so in this case, now the rest of your 1/4 mile buffer is pretty minimal. You may not even really need that much of a reconnaissance survey. There may not be many other standing structures within that 1/4 mile buffer, but those 2 sites that are immediately adjacent and very likely to be potentially affected by future development should be fully evaluated. So as I said, the level of effort is unique to each site based on what is within the site and what is around the site. If additional information is recommended, the entity seeking site certification must decide if they want to proceed. This is not a question for the SHPO. So as a consultant, if you say, I will proceed with a phase 1 investigation, I would probably advise your client that if the phase 1 identifies things, we may have to do additional investigation work before we can achieve site certification. And I think, as Sarah pointed out earlier, not every site is certifiable. Not every site is going to meet the threshold. The reason we do this level of research and this identification process is to identify those hazards or issues, or in some cases, cultural and historically significant resources that shouldn't be impacted or removed. And so it's important to go through this process. Only finished reports, complete investigation, are submitted to SHPO for review and comment. This means, as I said earlier, if a phase 1 survey identifies a site and recommends a phase 2 for delineation or evaluation, it's only after that phase 2 is completed that you would fully submit and conclude consultation. If Standing Structures recommends more research, it is only after that research is completed before site certification consultation is submitted and concluded. And then I added a point down here that IEDA and SHPO are available for additional technical assistance during certification investigation, but it is not under the 45-day review period of the MOU. Now, 45 days is a pretty standard comment period, and hopefully we would get back to you sooner. I'm just trying to say that outside of the MOU, outside of just blindly doing the evaluation for your client and submitting it to SHPO, if there are questions or concerns about level of review, it would be great to ask those first, because what we often find is that the entity seeking site certification doesn't necessarily speak the lingo. The consultant prepares the report, sends it in. It goes to SHPO. It may take 30 to 45 days for them to review it just to find that it's insufficient, just to find that it didn't meet these requirements we've talked about today. And then, you know, as you all know, people get upset and disgruntled, and it's frustrating that why did it take 45 days just for me to be told that it's not good enough? And so if you have questions while you're doing investigation, it's much better to ask up front than to wait until you've submitted your report already. And then I just wanted to talk about some challenges. For those of us who work in the cultural resources industry, we understand the uniqueness of site certification. We understand, and we're going to hear a little bit more about the benefit once sites are certified. But there are challenges that we face in going through this process that we want you to know that we know, because I hear from a lot of consultants these challenges as if we don't know it. And so I think it's important to know that, you know, the SHPO folks are here today, IEDA is here, we know these challenges, and these are things that we need to work through to successfully get to site certification for your consultants. So there is no scope of work. Typically, if you were to be hired for a Section 106 consultation process, you know your scope of work. You know the dimensions of it, how deep they're going to go, how wide they're going to go. But in this, you don't. So you have to gauge your level of investigation on a variety of work and disturbance anywhere within that certification area. And so if there are areas that are sensitive or have resources that are too cost prohibitive to evaluate, you need to go back to your client and delineate areas as undevelopable, as Sarah mentioned, or find ways to work through that so that it's not coming to the State Historic Preservation Office as an incomplete submittal. There's typically no known federal agency at the time of site certification. We are generally working with privately owned property and no federal agency. I say typically because there has been an exemption. If property is owned by the federal government, they are certainly the federal agency involved, and consultation is different. It's treated more like Section 110 consultation rather than just simply site certification consultation. So it's important to know who your entity seeking site certification is, and if there is a federal agency involved. But without a federal agency, it does make it very challenging to communicate with tribes if you have a potentially significant prehistoric site. Identifying those APEs, again, like I said, if we were to put a cell tower up in any one of these site certification properties, we may not have done enough level of effort that the federal agency would typically require. And then the effort for site certification may be beyond what would be required for private development, but it's necessary to certify the site. So if you hear from your consultant, well, why am I doing this? Why I don't have to do this if I want to build my own building. That may be true, but it's a requirement for site certification. And what we find is that with site certification, you know, typically these materials are available for a federal agency to use if there is federal funds or permitting 106 consultations triggered, but it's also triggered for that permitting component. And a lot of our projects do require some form of Army Corps permitting or something where there may not be federal funds, but even a private individual may have to go through a permitting process. And then when you do finish your report, consultation of the SHPO should be clearly submitted as technical assistance in association with the MOU, have a clear cover letter. We provide guidance through our office to the applicants seeking site certification on what should go in that cover letter. I encourage all cultural resources managers to be in very good contact with their clients, because it's the client who's going to know how to submit this. It is not Section 106. It should not have a federal finding associated with it. You should never say no adverse effect or no historic properties affected, and the letter should come from your client. So those are important things to remember. All right, now I think we're gonna hold questions till the very end, and then we're gonna hear a little bit about the benefits of site certification.
All right, so really the benefits of certification, our clients, they are very risk averse. So that can be cost, that can be schedule. So again, not having that specific scope of work can be very challenging. So you can't always answer every question. Certification doesn't answer every question, but it's going to answer a lot of things, especially those unknowns, because as site selection consultants, we don't like those surprises that we're looking at a site and then all of a sudden, oh wait, there's a cemetery in the middle, that kind of thing. Because again, clients risk averse, that's going to be a schedule buster. But it gives that opportunity for communities to be more competitive in site selection projects, more effective marketing, proactive. You can go out, you have a piece of property that's really much more marketable, less risk. for those clients, and reactive too. Again, I kind of talked about that response time on those RFPs. You're able to respond quickly and accurately too. I really think a benefit is knowing that site strengths and weaknesses. There's not a perfect site out there. So there may be a site, there may be a wetlands or something that you have to work around, but you know about all of that ahead of time and what those steps may be that would be required to mitigate that or whatever's necessary for that. You're better prepared to offer development assistance. So again, with no perfect site, when we're going through and we're doing our detailed incentive analysis and cost comparison, one site's going to have different needs than another site. So we're going to come to you and say, okay, we've got some issues with this water line extension, whatever. Knowing the property's overall strengths and weaknesses will help a community be more prepared on the incentive side as well, to know what might be some of those weaknesses that they're going to have to answer financially. And then again, really, it's all about schedule too. So certification, again, doesn't answer every question, but it's going to minimize that schedule. So we're going to know exactly how long it's going to take to get cost and schedule. And talk about that 90-day for the mitigation. We have all these timelines associated. So again, these certified sites represent those sites that are going to be quicker speed to market. And communities, they're just more prepared with sites that are ready for development, because at the end of the day, companies don't build sites in communities where, you know, the quality of life and the workforce that they have to build on a piece of dirt or an existing building on that matter too. But so that's why it's important to really go through this process, have those prepared sites and that inventory for those types of clients. And then Amy, I think you want to talk a little bit about IEDA's activities.
Right, so we obviously, as the authority, want to make sure that the applicants going through this process have sites that are marketable and that they know how to sell and that are up in front of our account managers and others site selectors' knowledge base. So we have a dedicated web page right now for our certified sites on Iowa Economic Development's website. So there's a certified site there. You can go to that web page. You'll see a map of all the certified sites where they're located, and you'll see a click through them that will take them out to the lowest record, which is the record, the database that site selectors and developers use to find properties and buildings, sites and buildings that are available for lease or purchase for development. So right now we have a single landing page with all of the sites listed on it, and you immediately leave that landing page and go out to another website, the lowest website. We're in the process right now in the effort to further develop this and market this program to build individual landing pages for each one of the certified sites as they come on board. So you'll have a web page. We'll keep the web page on our IEDA site that has the map and shows all the locations, and then you'll either be able to click through clicking on a location or by a list that a table that we'll have below, and you can click through and sort by size, location, things like that. So you go out to your site, you go to that landing page for that specific site. You'll be able to get a lot more information about the site itself, as well as the community, points of interest in the community. And we're also building an interactive map on that landing page, because we create a master set of 8 mapping plans for each one of our certified sites, so it's consistent among all of our sites. And from those 8 maps, then we've developed an interactive map that a developer can go on and take a look at the proposed and existing water lines, for example, or electric lines or fiber, whatever they wanted to look at on that, to give them a better picture of where things were located or where things were potentially going to be located upon development. So we're doing that as a component. We also have a lot of marketing push right now with trade shows. We're definitely keeping those certified sites at the point of interest of potential developers. We do a lot of web and social media advertising for these sites. We're also going to be doing drone coverage of all of the sites, again, so it's consistent among all sites that we have available, in addition to having articles on our specific Iowa-based certification program in magazines such as Site Solutions, which is a national site selector magazine. So we're really trying to make this a benefit, and as you'll see here, success. We have several examples of success through the certification program. Our Eastern Iowa Center in Davenport, they really went through the process. They proactively marketed that. We were able to keep the Kraft Heinz plant here because that site was certified. They were looking at shutting that plant down, which was antiquated in their eyes, and they went in, did a rebuild, and kept that plant there, retained jobs, brought in new jobs. And then they brought in several other companies as well with, you can see quite a bit of capital investment and jobs increase in the area. Just closer to home, even our Norwalk site, which recently was consumed with 2 prospects, Michael Foods and Windsor Windows and Doors, and those were able to turn ground faster and get on project and get production out the door quicker because of the fact that they were a certified site. So there definitely are benefits, and we are trying to really put our best foot forward to help market those to get some development and some good industry impact here in the state.
All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. I know the majority of our audience are the cultural resources investigators or the folks doing the survey work. So I think we had a question here in-house.
I just had a comment.
Oh, okay.
I was, talking again about the benefits. Most recently, this last year, I've run into where it's been beneficial to have as much work done as possible, primarily because the private sector proponents of development on these sites were utilizing USDA money, rural development money. USDA has a process by which they require an environmental assessment worksheet, of which they classify the NEPA level of documentation from that. And if you at the EAW level have all this done, it's going to save a lot of heartache on the part of the proponents who are trying to get USDA backing for their loan funds. I mean, significant investment backing from USDA, rural development.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason that the bar is set where it is set for this level of certification is for that purpose exactly, that if you were to use federal funds, you would have, for those of you familiar with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, you would have your required Section 106 documents, which is part of your NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, compliance information bundled together and ready to go. So the hope, you still have to go through the process, but this gets you there that much faster, as we've heard.
The second one was EDA, and EDA, again, they go through a similar process. They don't use an EAW, but they use a similar process to classify those projects for, and in this case, it was grant funding.
Exactly,
So,
yeah, all federal agencies are required to comply if they expend funds or issue a permit. So this process would be required for any federally funded project. We get a little bit of pushback when we hear that it's just private development, they would never need it anyway. But if you are seeking any of those grants, loans, federal funding sources, or seeking federal permits, this documentation would work for you. Did we have anyone? I know with the Skype system, you can type questions if you're linked through Skype, but I can't see them. So
You don't have it yet, but just remind them if they have a question to unmute themselves.
yeah, if you have a question, be sure to unmute yourself. Is there anybody on the call that has questions? Was this beneficial?
I'm sorry, I do have a few questions. This is Ed Rodnicki from Terracon in beautiful Omaha. One of the, okay, first of all, and I'm sure the other people online are interested, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, so our intent was not to publish it in advance because we wanted people to participate, but we do hope to take this, and hopefully it is recorded, and then we will publish both the presentation with the audio recording so that you can pass it along to anyone who might have missed it.
Because, yes, please, and that's my intent. One of the questions was, you mentioned, in the documentation it talks about a mega site, and would you please define that?
The site is 1,000+ acres for a single user.
Okay, so pardon me, that's outside my area because I'm talking about something smaller. Sorry, I believe you've answered. That was the only other question, and thank you.
Okay, and what we didn't get into today, it's hard to sort of frame this conversation in a way to give you enough information, but not too much information. The site certification program that we work with here at IEDA, please peruse our website if you have more interest, but there are levels of certification for different size. We also have a green infrastructure certification, which is a little bit different. And then there are steps to the process. So there's a step 1, a step 2, and a step 3. And the cultural resources kind of falls technically in step 3, but we like to give you a heads up in step 2 because it is there's a cost associated with this level of investigation that we certainly don't want an entity who might get a site that might not be appropriate for certification identified in step 2 to have incurred these costs too early. So we are sensitive to that, but essentially what you'll need to know is that by the time you're being contracted for archaeological or architectural services, your client has likely already made contact with IEDA and is working through the steps of the process. Yes?
So initially you, IEDA and SHPO sit down to look at these areas preliminarily speaking?
So we actually do that after a site has made it to step 2. So we're not at the very beginning.
Some of my questions lie are, for example, in the third map that you showed with 2 farmsteads that are technically outside of the project area, but you're saying they should be fully inventoried, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are you leaving that up to the consultant to decide what outside of the actual project area needs to be looked at? I mean, that's not a decision that the consultant should necessarily be making because we're being presented with an RFP or something like that to bid on a project.
Right.
I think it would be, that aside too, I think it would be extremely important for IEDA and SHPO to let the applicants know ahead of time that if we find something that warrants phase 2, what we would normally call phase 2 work, that it's going to get expensive.
Right, and that's what, so essentially when we started rolling this out, we first came up with the MOU and thought, hey, this will be slick and easy. And we started getting comments back and consultants who didn't know the level of effort and applicants who didn't know what to hire for. So we started the pre-review, and this is a site that pre-reviewed this year, and we did in our comments identify what appears. So this is the actual map they provided us, right? You can tell the quality and the location, it's kind of difficult. We are guessing here that these are historic farmsteads. We can look at historic aerials, but we're not on site. So based on the information that they've given us, we recommended an intensive, a phase 1 for the archaeological and a full Iowa site inventory evaluation for those 2 resources. So that's in our pre-review comments. Typically our pre-review comments go to the entity seeking site certification prior to them hiring a cultural resources consultant. We can't always time it perfectly because we don't always know what they're doing, but that is our goal, that we get those pre-review comments to the applicant prior to them hiring someone so that it is part of the RFP. But again, I can't know from this map if there is a really significant resource somewhere else that we're not identifying. So that's what does make it challenging.
Well, that's where the challenge comes in here, and that brings me to another question here is.
Well, hold on, before you answer that question, I wanted to comment, is one of the things that we have kind of lessons learned through the process is we've provided this MOU, it's in the program materials that they get at step 2. We provide these comments that SHPO has provided, but what we learned is they're not always getting passed along to you. So we're trying to do a better job of making sure, like, you need to take this and the comments and pass them along to you. So there's still like a lesson learned in there, but we understand that we're working.
That's great, and that does help a lot.
Yep.
The next part of my questions though comes in. Let's say in this one example, we inventory. A complete site inventory form is done for these farmsteads. Let's say one of those is eligible, so what you're saying now is this is out. It's outside of the project area. What's the terminology we're using here? Because we say it could be eligible, we can't say there's no adverse effect because we don't know what the effects are going to be, and that's federal lingo. But what is the wording you want us to use on something like this?
Yep. So you're going to evaluate it for National Register eligibility. So that's going to be pretty black and white. Either it's National Register eligible or it's not. And then the words that we've come up with in sort of site certification area and defined area, the buffer area, things like that, you're going to identify those. Now, what's going to happen is if it's an eligible resource, for the site to get certified, there's going to have to be some kind of appropriate response to that recommendation of eligibility. if the SHPO concurs with it, which we'll get through consultation. But what we most often find is that there is an appropriate buffer defined and marked as undevelopable. So if it's this site that's eligible, and this one's not, for those on the phone, I'm pointing to the one on the western edge of the property. You might want to say 100 yards this way is not developable. So that means that if there is a one-story light industrial building, it's always going to be built 100 yards away from here, and we've all sort of agreed that that's far enough away to not adversely affect, if there's federal funds involved, the view shed or the impact on this property. We're all kind of guessing here. You can't use those words, adverse effect and no historic properties affected, but you can say, we recommend a non-developable area here. And the same would be true if you found a significant archaeological site up here. You could delineate an appropriate buffer area.
So could that stay at the phase 1 level then? Because say it's back to an archaeology site. It's an archaeology site, phase 1.
Yeah.
Normally our recommendation would be more work, but an alternative would be to say this is an undevelopable area.
So I'm going to say it always depends on what the resource that you've identified is. I think there are certain types of resource that the State Historic Preservation Office would not be comfortable simply delineating a buffer, or the distance of that buffer may be increased or decreased, but presumably if it is the type of resource that can be delineated out of development and a sufficient buffer is identified and the applicant is willing to reduce the size, because what's ultimately going to happen is that area becomes, the certified site area that means you can build on this land becomes smaller. And so what impact that has on their minimum acreages, all of those things have to be taken into consideration, but ultimately your client will decide if that's the path they want to go down.
One thing we get other than this is like a master development plan, site concept plan that layers all of these things, not just the cultural. It could be we're avoiding a wetland, all of that kind of answers all of these kind of developable things. So that's what we're talking about, that buffer. That's what that final looks. We can't let them put a building on top of that kind of thing in concept.
But it is tricky because as the cultural resources, unlike wetlands that are more defined, delineated, you're going to have to sort of help your client figure out what that appropriate buffer is based on the type of resource you've identified. And then you submit it to the SHPO to see if they concur.
In other words,
always call for technical assistance before you submit your report.
In other words, in our report, we could provide some conditional findings saying that perhaps the sponsor could consider deleting these areas from the total project area.
My problem there is that doesn't always agree then with you're saying we can't submit this, or the applicant should not submit this report until these things have been completely figured out. You don't want it until there's been a phase 2 done on that site.
But I said that there's room for communication during the process, right? I mean, I want to be clear that you can pick up the phone, you can send an email, you can shoot a map and say, hey, does this look like an appropriate treatment in this report? What I don't want is a cover letter and all the report and all the paperwork saying, here, you have to certify this, because then it's not complete. But if you want to have the conversation about, we might have found something, we want to, and there may be some resources that the State Historic Preservation Office has a really hard time determining or agreeing with not eligible for archaeology because they can't consult with tribes yet. So there's a lot of conversations that need to happen if resources are identified.
That's exactly where I was going with this, is to say straight up do a phase 2 is not a good idea.
How do you, what about if
Depends on
it's
the client. I can't tell you is or is not a good idea. Anyways, go ahead. I'm sorry. The caller?
Oh, this is Marie Finn. I was just asking, what about if there's a visual adverse effect? I mean, we don't know yet what's going to go up on the property, but actually the slide that you have up now, if that farmstead right in the middle is eligible, and then, there are some industrial buildings that are built around there, there would probably be some sort of visual adverse effect. So how can that be reconciled? Like can this project move ahead, even if there is if you think that there might be a visual adverse effect?
Can I also tag on to that along the very same lines as when you're talking in the view shed, where your minimal level of effort is set at a reconnaissance architectural survey, which generally, among other things, means check the SHPO files, see what's been previously recorded. A lot of times what's been previously recorded also has a recommendation for more additional work. Well, now we can't under my understanding here is then we're also not able to submit this document without doing that additional work in a view shed here.
I think it depends on the proximity to the site. It's very difficult. These are the challenges. I'm right there with you. I understand the concerns. I think to Narit's point, we've tried to, I mean, that's sort of the quarter-mile buffer, is to establish what standing structures resources are within that average view shed area. But again, like, that's the reason in this case I would recommend full Iowa site inventory forms for these resources, because there probably is a high probability that industrial development could impact the view shed. But again, now if it's just a road and then all the development is back at the very far end of the site, maybe it won't have an adverse effect. We truly can't know unless we can't know what we don't know. And so we need full evaluation of the resources to know if they're eligible to begin with. And then we have to sort of take our best guess at what this potential development could be. It is very, very challenging. I'm glad to hear all these questions because it's the things that I've been talking to our team about for 4 years. So it's nice to read through that.
I mean, to follow up with that, can there be a mitigation even before there is?
Great question. From what I hear from our site certification folks, there are other states that do, as that one slide showed, mitigate in advance of certification. I do not believe that that will happen here in Iowa. I think we typically follow the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act pretty closely to the letter of the law that says the federal agency is the only agency that can identify an adverse effect and mitigate to resolve adverse effect. So in the absence of a federal agency, it is highly unlikely that mitigation would occur. Which means that that site just might not be appropriate for site certification at this time. But the documentation and the level of effort that you produced in this process would certainly help that federal agency with their future mitigation.
Excuse me, one last question. You talked about tribal coordination. Since we don't have a federal interest, who does the tribal coordination?
Yeah, so at this level of site certification, because you're dealing with a private entity and a state office, there technically is no nation-to-nation consultation. So that's what makes, if you do find a resource that is prehistoric or would trigger tribal consultation, you could reach out to the tribe. It's not obviously federally required at this point, as long as we're not talking about human remains. But simply having the research and documentation completed and available so that if and when there is a federal agency involved, that would be, the federal agency would then take your report and consult with the tribes. We've had these conversations back and forth quite a bit. I mean, this is where we struggle with archaeologists determining eligibility on prehistoric sites if there has been no tribe, because technically the way that the law is written is that the archaeologist does their research and makes a recommendation, but it is truly the federal agency that makes the determination of eligibility, and they do so in consultation with tribes. And in this case, we have no federal agency, so we're relying heavily on recommendations of eligibility from consultants. Yeah, so we've only got 3 more minutes before we need to wrap up and transition to our next meeting. Are there any other questions on the call?
Thank you. No.
All right. Well, I appreciate all of your time.
One more just quick comment. I just would caution the cultural consultants here that, or actually even the project proponents who are trying to certify these sites, I would caution them not to be scared off by the results of a phase 1 that says do a phase 2. The reason I say that is because this land has value. And this land has value not just to the communities, but to someone individually. And to set off a piece of land because we think that it might have 3-5 acres of, prehistoric archaeological deposits there, That's a little bit, I think it's a little bit premature, and it's like saying on a contaminated site with an environmental covenant, we're never gonna use this land again for anything because it's got lead in the soil, right? Well, all of a sudden that land is perpetually taken out of productivity. And I'm much in the favor of land recycling. And even in the case of cultural resources, I don't want cultural resources to be an inhibitor to maximizing the use of the land, because we think there might be something there. And thus taking it out of certification, thus taking it out of redevelopment or development potential. So just a caution there.
And I would also say the one thing that I've learned in going through site certification over the last 6 years is that it does provide an asset. It is challenging, it is complicated, but we are providing these owners with a resource and an asset, and we are documenting the resources that are on this site in a way that they may never have been documented before. These may go straight into private development. They may never have triggered an archaeological investigation before. So we have to think about the benefit that we're providing to both this owner and the state inventory in doing this investigation work, identifying areas that have, no probability for archaeological sites, as well as those with higher probability, and then the same with standing structures. We are able to go in and document resources that otherwise could be demolished at any moment and never documented. So we do have to look at it from the benefit of both the value of the development or potential development, as well as the value of the recordation that we're doing. So thank you all for your time. We will try hard to get this uploaded as soon as possible. And please email me if you have any questions, Ann Schmid, ann.schmid@iowaeda.com. Thank you.